Hi, I'm Hamish Black and welcome to Writing on Games. Just as a little heads up, today I'm going to be talking about Campo Santo's recent release Firewatch. This game is, as you may already know, almost entirely centred on its narrative. As a result, it becomes incredibly difficult to discuss in a critical sense without going into at least some cursory story elements. It's a game that, at the end of the day, I'd kind of recommend playing, so if you haven't played it yet and want to go in blind, I'd suggest you go and play it before watching this video. I'll try to avoid any major spoilers, but what you define as a major spoiler might be entirely different to me. With that in mind, you have been warned. Now let's talk about Firewatch. Firewatch is a game about choice. It's an aggressively linear game which focuses on telling an incredibly singular tale that the player has little to no control over, but it is about choice nonetheless. It's about choosing to run away from one's problems. It's about choosing to start a new life, and the player gets a say in how their character shapes their own identity. But ultimately, every choice in the game seems to prove somewhat futile. The game always follows the same steps, hits the same narrative beats, and concludes in the same way. How then does the game make these choices in any way meaningful? There are indeed many choices in terms of dialogue between Henry and Delilah, but they never actually amount to anything tangible in terms of how they affect the game's progression through its narrative. You get presented with a choice, you choose the line, Henry says the line, Delilah responds, and the game continues. Furthermore, critics of other adventure games, such as Life is Strange and the developer's previous work The Walking Dead Season 1, have criticised the games for the seemingly illusory nature of their choices. That is to say, they feel, rightly or wrongly, I would suggest wrongly, that the games pushed themselves as games where the player's choices could really affect the outcome of the story, and they were disappointed to find out that their impact on the game's outcome was perhaps not as grand as they might have been led to believe. Many players measured the rather nebulous concept of choice by how different the presumed multiple endings of the game can turn out. However, as I will attempt to exemplify through analysis of Firewatch, this is perhaps not the best metric by which to measure the value of a game's choices. In fact, one might go so far as to say that the seemingly inconsequential nature of the choices presented to the player in games like Firewatch actually end up giving the player a greater sense of place within the world their character inhabits. In order to do this, perhaps we can analyse Firewatch's approach to character in the way that Roland Barthes imagines the death of the author. In his essay on the concept, whilst analysing and asking hypothetical questions of the identity of the author in Balzac's Saracen, he states that it will always be impossible to know, for the good reason that all writing is itself this special voice, consisting of several indiscernible voices, and that literature is precisely the invention of this voice, to which we cannot assign a specific origin. Literature is the trap where all identity is lost, beginning with the very identity of the body that writes. Probably this has always been the case. Once an action is recounted, this disjunction occurs, the voice loses its origin, the author enters his own death, writing begins. It's important to note that Barthes here is largely discussing the idea of metafiction, or texts that are about the idea of being a text, which doesn't inherently describe Firewatch, but because of its very nature as a narrative-driven game and the interactivity of the medium, there are still some interesting parallels to be drawn here. This idea of writing beginning once the origin of the author becomes obfuscated, and therefore authorship becomes placed on the person experiencing a text, is perhaps at the very heart of the way games like Firewatch and, for example, Kentucky Route Zero present their choices to the player. The simple dialogue choices the player experiences might not alter the overarching story in any particularly meaningful way, but in the moments they are presented to the player, they help the player subtly shape their character, or at the very least their understanding of the character, which in turn helps contextualise the more significant narrative beats at a more identifiably individual level. For example, take one of the earliest scenarios in the game, where Henry confronts some drunken teenagers setting off fireworks at the lake. This situation will always end with Henry taking some form of action or inaction, and the teenagers becoming annoyed and running off. The game builds up to this situation by first presenting the player with the remnants of the teenagers' excess. Beer cans strewn everywhere allow Henry the option to pick these up or leave them be, as well as presenting the option of taking some whiskey for himself. He then passes by the teenagers' clothes, which Delilah ribs him about, until finally he is presented with the teenagers themselves, naked, accusing Henry of being a pervert with the stereo blasting. One can do many things here, but the outcome is always the same. Henry walks away having caused some form of annoyance to the teenagers, causing them to swim away. What's intriguing about this is that despite the outcome always being the same, the way the player navigates the dialogue choices presented to them from as early as the very beginning of the game shape Henry's character in very subtle ways, which contextualise this situation somewhat differently for every player. With the text segment at the start describing the decline of his wife's health, players can make decisions regarding Henry's reactions to various situations. Is the player's Henry the kind of guy that will get visibly mad when she comes in late, or will he pretend that everything is okay and let the anger fester due to his inability to assert himself? Is he the kind of person who worries enough to lock his ill wife in her room whilst he goes to drink, or does he treat the situation with a kind of reckless abandon due to his supposed distance from the situation around him? These small choices help to characterise Henry in drastically different ways. Regardless of your choices, he is going to be flawed, and his life will play out the same, but in the player's head it calibrates Henry's character as either an assertive, almost violent asshole, or an awkward, clumsy oaf. This continues as the player comes across the beer cans. Is the player's version of Henry the kind of person to obsessively pick up every can, despite its lack of impact on the larger narrative? Does he take the whiskey for himself or confiscate it? When he comes across the clothes, does he respond to Delilah's quips, or does he become coy about it? All of these choices create something of a metagame, where each choice branches out into the same set of choices, but with a slightly different context depending on your previous choices, all for the sake of contextualising Henry's character in the player's head. For example, does Henry leave the cans and go straight for the whiskey because he's a borderline alcoholic that doesn't really care about his job? Or does he treat the whiskey as a reward for doing his job, still hinting at some kind of alcohol problem? Or does he confiscate everything altogether? These choices culminate in the meeting with the teenagers, which now can take on several different forms of context in the player's head. Does Henry shyly and awkwardly ask the teens to stop setting off fireworks before just running away from their barrage of emasculating insults? Does he take the stereo and run, still running away from confrontation in a situation where his opponents cannot effectively respond? Or does he present his aggressive side by picking up the stereo and violently tossing it into the water before shouting at the teenagers? Again, it all ends in the same way. The teenagers end up leaving the situation. However, each subtle choice the player has made up until this point that seemingly have no consequence on the game at large, help them make this cumulative decision of how they are going to deal with the situation regarding the teens. These subtle dialogue choices place the authorship of the more subtle elements of Henry's character onto the player, and therefore each situation becomes more meaningful to the player as it is their individual, subtly crafted version of Henry experiencing and responding to these situations. Each version of Henry the player can create in their heads will inevitably be flawed as the larger narrative beats remain the same for everyone, but the ways in which he is flawed are left up to the player. Is he a violent thug, an apathetic weirdo, or an awkward man-child? These outcomes are all Henry, as written and constructed by the developers and writers, but the decision as to which version of Henry the player takes on is left at almost every turn to the player. This, arguably, is the kind of situation Bart talks about when he states that the unity of a text is not its origin, but its destination. In order to make the game's choices more meaningful to the player, the writers must give up authority in a way that only games can allow, and place faith in the intelligence of the player to value consistency in their vision of the character. Is the game fully successful in realising this lofty vision? Not entirely. I would argue that the game almost doesn't go far enough with the idea of transferring authorship onto the player. The main reason for this, as I see it, is that the game doesn't seem to know whether it wants to be this compelling character drama based on the player's vision of Henry formed through subtle dialogue choices, or if it wants to focus on the creeping mystery until right at the game's conclusion, and ends up resolving neither in a particularly satisfying way as a result. And another warning, this section might get into some spoilers, but I'll avoid them as best I can. Now, in order to illustrate this, I'm going to have to make a comparison that some might see as easy, but it's appropriate. Gone Home. Both of these games, on the surface, appear to do very similar things. They both feature some form of mystery regarding the character's place in the world, and ultimately resolve to reveal that the mystery is far more grounded and human than the player might have initially imagined. However, the way in which both games go about this is what differentiates them. Gone Home almost starts with a kind of unbearable tension. In many ways it almost feels like a horror game, but as the game progresses, this tension that there might be something strange, occult and hostile taking place slowly gives way to a more human story about a relative's struggles to find their sexual identity. The tension begins high, but gradually falls away, allowing the player to slowly become accustomed to the shift in focus. Firewatch, however, does the opposite, and ends up bungling its mystery as a result. It starts off with almost no mystery whatsoever, we're given Henry's almost full backstory. And then, as the game goes on, it begins to hint more and more to the player that something strange might actually be happening. It actually builds this tension in a pretty masterful way, constantly upping the ante to the point where the player begins to question the reality they find themselves in, and foregrounding some of the more mechanical elements of the game. The recordings of radio conversations, for example, presented almost like a script, and every turn the player takes feels like it could result in grave danger. This tension is taken to almost absurd levels as the player begins to wonder about potential government conspiracies, or even if the developers are playing some kind of sinister mind games with the player, only for the game to do the whole gone home thing and reveal to the player that actually the mystery doesn't matter and the whole point of the story was the building up of Henry and Delilah's relationship. Not only was this a disappointingly obvious way for the story to go, the difference between Gone Home and Firewatch is the way that Gone Home allows the player to acclimatise early on to the idea that the mystery doesn't actually matter or really even exist, whereas Firewatch builds the mystery and tension to a point where it seems like the developers want the player to focus on that rather than the relationship between Henry and Delilah. It represents a disappointing lack of consistency in a game which could have been truly considered one of the better implementations of narrative delivery in a game if the writers had just stuck with either the relationship between Henry and Delilah and the way the player's choices contextualise large situations, or stick the landing in terms of the mystery by providing it a satisfactory conclusion worthy of the tension the game creates before then. Despite this lack of a satisfactory conclusion, however, it's hard to deny that, at least initially, the game does some incredibly interesting things with the notion of player choice. If we imagine that The Walking Dead Season 1 presents the player with numerous massive decisions that shape the nature of the larger narrative going forward, but change little about the way the player views the characters, Firewatch chooses to focus on how the player contextualises very singular events by bringing the consequences of their choices down to a micro, character-driven level. This is where Firewatch absolutely shines in my opinion, and as a result I would still recommend people pick up and play. If it exemplifies anything, however, it's that games as a medium are still in a state of constant flux. We are far from reaching the supposed pinnacle of narrative delivery in games at this point, and these games can very much be viewed as narrative experiments, which in turn draw from the narrative experiments in games of the past few years, such as The Stanley Parable or Dear Esther. Which, for the record, Dear Esther is one of the least fulfilling experiences I have ever had playing a game, but it was significant for the development of the medium nonetheless. It is incredibly interesting to trace the lineage of this game through those earlier experiments in narrative delivery that seemed so revolutionary at the time, but now feel strangely dated. It's also immensely exciting, however, to imagine how these kinds of games can develop and iterate on both the successes and shortcomings of these games and the way they present choice to the player, and I for one very much look forward to engaging with the evolving discourse as more of these types of games are released. And with all of that said, I'm Hamish Black, and that concludes yet another episode of Writing on Games. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.